Hi everyone, and welcome to today's podcast, Wine and Markets with Dan and Cam. My name is Daniel Sternovsky,
And I'm Cameron Kirker.
and welcome to today's session. So before we start, I thought get a little bit more of those disclaimer and nitty-gritties out of the way. So anything you hear on today's podcast is general in nature for information, educational, and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, financial, legal, or tax advice. If necessary, please contact your financial advisor, accountant, or investment professional for any more information.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. So in terms of what we'll be talking about today, I guess there's a few areas. So we're going to be talking about wine. And the theme we've chosen is firstly coming out of a recession. So we've got a 2009 Hunter Valley Semillon, and then the boom times, which we have to go back a bit of ways, but we're talking 2006, full heat of the mining boom, like giveaways under the coalition government back then, like really boom times for the Aussie economy. We're going to break it up, so we'll talk about the 2006 wine at the end. In terms of what topics we're going to touch on today, some of the hot ones. So interest rates is a really big one, what central banks are doing around the world and closer to home. Economic growth, like are we going to have hard or soft landing? We'll explain what we mean by those. And also just a little bit on inflation, and I'll leave that to Dan, and then we'll sort of wrap up talking about the wines and also introducing our new rating system as well, which my friend over here is really keen on.
And well, I didn't think we didn't have a rating last time on those two wines. And I thought we needed to have at least something out there. So I think I'm excited for that part.
No, definitely. So in terms of the first wine, so what we've got here is a Hunter Valley Semillon. So that's kind of sounds at that variety is well known to come from France, and what we do here in Australia is quite a bit of a different take on it. So it's something when it's So it's something that when it's young, they can be quite acidic. And
sorry, I was waiting there for a second. Like, should I be drinking? I'm really drink this. So there we go. Continue. Yeah.
No. So yeah, when they're young, they're quite acidic, but they've got what people call citrus flavours, so lemon and lime typically. But the acidity levels are quite high from Hunter. Now, what happens though when they're old, and so this is 2009, so we're talking 13 years in the bottle for it. What happens is they start to develop more complex flavours, and I guess how I describe this, it's like lemon and lime, almost like preserved lemon, but then it's toasty as well. And
it's got a bit of toastiness, but it's almost like it's not that toastiness can be also disguised as something a little bit woody, or
it can be, but there's nothing
that sort of lingers, or it's actually quite delicious, to be honest.
Yeah, and so in terms of food recommendations, this with seafood, like we had it earlier tonight with oysters, and then bunch of different like fish and scallops and the like, and it's just the dangerous part about it is it's very smashable. So if you had a couple of bottles of these handy for gathering,
you could easily get through quite a few. It wasn't quite hard, to be honest, but no, this one was fantastic.
And lower alcohol too. This is I think 11%.
But it's actually delicious. It paired really well with everything. So pairings are pretty much anything seafood based.
Yeah.
I would even say probably, even if you had like a white sauce type pasta, probably.
Because you've got
a cheesy, like a heavy cheese. This would be
because you've got a nice bit of acidity still there that will cut through like richer dishes as well. So even if it's, chicken or porchetta or something I think it'll work quite nicely actually. So basically a delicious wine, and part of the reason I wanted to try it tonight is I'd heard like people rave about old Hunter Valley Semillon, and so managed to find a bottle at auction for a reasonable price. And I'm like, oh, well, this is a good excuse to give it a go. And so we did.
Or at least it would be quite nice with a chicken palmy, I would say.
Oh yeah, palmy, schnitzel, any.
And for those who don't know what a chicken palmy is, chicken parmigiana.
No, it's.
We're already good at the explanations. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a delicious wine and sort of harkens back. 2009, we were coming out of the global financial crisis, which granted here in Australia wasn't anywhere near as painful as what we saw
as much as overseas.
I mean, well, we were in uni back then, right? And it was first year uni. It was a very different world back then, but. Yeah, it sort of harkens back to, that's kind of we've come through a pretty painful period post-COVID, and now finally it seems like the worst of it's behind us. And so, yeah, give it a chance. And like we're going to talk a bit about some of those concerns about the economy a bit later. So I guess for now to start with, we might just touch on sort of general context with interest rates and I guess what's going on there, and basically you look around the world and bar Europe and Japan, they're going up they're only going in one direction.
I would probably classify as if you break up the world. So you have the developed world.
Yep.
That US, Australia, Europe, that is looking to raise rates around the world.
Yep.
And then you have emerging markets, which are probably going the other way. Potentially.
Arguably, but funnily enough, even though people weren't talking about it because they don't cover those economies closely, they've actually been hiking rates the last few years.
So this is probably where they're getting at in terms of going the other way potentially. Yeah. So that's an interesting sort of just to delineate or see what the different parts of the world are, what have they been doing, and what the rest of the, I guess, developed world is doing.
Yeah, and look, if we look closer to home, to be honest with you, I think one thing I underestimated with this whole thing is the whole political side of it. It's sort of, for me, I thought RBA's like, no, we've got, clear lines that we need to cross before we actually do any rate hikes, and arguably they jumped ahead of those lines, and I think part of that is just pressure. Like people see, plastered on the paper.
Well, this is the thing. So you had before the election, where the first rate rise. So you had it on. Okay, well they were looking at wage inflation as the main indicator. So inflation did come out beforehand.
Yep.
They didn't have that wage data that comes out on the 10th. So my assumption was it'd probably wait until June, but again that wasn't the case. So they decided to change course because what they had originally said was, hey, we'll wait and look at what wages are doing and see to make a decision after that.
Yeah, and so in the RBA's defence, they'll turn around and say, well, we talk to industry constantly, and they were pointing towards some pretty hefty wage rises coming through. And so we kind of felt we needed to jump ahead of what the official data might suggest. And funnily enough, the official data came through and it was still suggesting, I wouldn't say anemic, like weak wage growth, but I wouldn't say it was explosively
no, that's right.
like strong wage growth either. And so what's going to be really interesting for me, at least, if we get the June wage data in the second half of this year, and it's like, if that's still not showing a big wage breakout, then you're kind of asking the question, like, has the RBA jumped the gun a bit, arguably? So yeah, it's been a bit of a tough one, and I think going back to, I guess, one of the reasons why, like, sort of my personal beliefs were wrong is probably on the political side, and I think you see that in some other countries as well in terms of, I guess, the pace of the hikes, like those the headlines you see in the US where inflation is running a lot hotter than it is over here. I think they have finally borne fruit this year, and you've seen the Federal Reserve over there hike interest rates quite aggressively and flag that they're going to do more on that front as well. So, and that's part of the thing that's fed through into financial markets, right? So shares, particularly in things that were, arguably a lot of their value was still to come in the future. Those sort of names had sold off a lot. So it's like the Nasdaq, which is like a index that's full of tech stocks, that had corrected quite a bit.
I guess just for those listening, in
Yeah.
terms of how does this really affect everything in terms of why is this so important, and how does that sort of that flow-on effect into markets come from, I guess, rate rises, but also what they're really targeting and looking at, why that's so important.
Yeah. So I guess there's two ways to think about it. So one is central banks, in their official tagline, is we don't want people's expectations of inflation to get out of whack.
Yep.
So if people's expectations of inflation get too high, the worry is it'll feed this feedback loop where people will be more proactive in their spending to preempt inflation, and it'll start entrenching higher levels of inflation beyond what they target, which in the RBA's case is sort of a 2 to 3% range, right? And for the Federal Reserve, it's an average inflation rate of 2% over the course of the economic cycle. Why does it matter? I think people give you different explanations, but the way I like to think about it is, if the value of cash goes up because the interest on your cash in bank goes up, everything else has to reprice relative to that. And what I mean by that is, you know what, I can just keep my money in the bank and I'm going to get a higher return than I was a month ago.
Yep.
Well, damn, why would I put it in something that has a bit more risk, whether that's bonds, which can go down when interest rates go up, or whether it's shares, which, different companies can sell off all the time. I can just keep it in the bank or a term deposit and get a decent return. Like, when that happens, you naturally start to see money flowing towards cash as an alternative and out of all the other assets, really. And it's that the way I like to think about it is, no asset is an island. Everything's competing for people's money, right? And look, there are some assets that have guaranteed buys because of regulation and the like. But outside of that, everything has to compete on its own. And if suddenly just having cash in the bank, like, I remember, this makes me feel old, when I first started working full time, I could get nearly 5% from a high interest savings account. Like 5%, I don't have to do anything, work for it, right? And I got an email this week, I can get 1.35% from the same bank. I'm like, oh, that's just sexy stuff, right?
I know which bank you're talking about. No, that's hilarious. No. But you're right. And it's that competition for that money, and where it's going.
And the other thing is just making borrowing expensive, right? Yes. Which, if we talk about Aussie property, like, the way I like to think about it, if it costs more to service a mortgage, right, the total amount you can borrow is going to be naturally restricted. And if that happens to everyone in aggregate, it becomes a lot harder to fuel, higher and higher property prices.
So I guess just to move on to the specific on, okay, well, when we're looking at rising interest rates and the common term of soft landing and hard landing, if you raise rates too much, you break the economy. I think that's the concern.
Yep.
And then, how do you delineate as a Fed member or as an RBA member? What level do we get to before we sort of break the economy, so to speak, or really hurt valuations in markets? And how do they, really prepare for that? Where are we sort of seeing it going? Are we seeing more of a, I guess, first of all, let's define that hard landing and soft landing. But then secondly, where are we sort of seeing that in terms of an outlook? Are we going to see potentially a soft landing, or are we going to see potentially a hard landing?
Yeah. So I guess on the hard versus soft question, I think I'll take the soft land. So the soft land is the idea that, central banks in their infinite wisdom are watching the economy super closely, right? As they do, and they're going to make sure that they watch it and they fine tune their interest rates enough so they stop hiking or maybe even start easing to ensure our economy, or whatever economy they control, doesn't dip into recession, right?
Yeah.
So a soft landing would see a period where economic growth's a bit weaker than maybe it is on average, but we don't actually see an outright recession, right? Whereas a hard landing scenario is basically,
they stuff up.
They stuff up, and we actually see a proper recession. So, and how can we get a hard landing from interest rates? It's basically you make borrowing too expensive. You start to see that whole a few things. You start to see mortgages become too costly. So businesses as well, the flow through there.
Yeah.
Businesses, mortgages, and just credit in general starts to seize up. And if you don't have, a reasonable level of credit growth, it's very hard for your economy to grow unless you're pumping out exports left and right. Because you don't have that injection.
Well, that's right. And think of, as a car engine, think of credit as, your lubricants to make things, the pistons and whatnot, move and turn without sort of stopping. So credit is that lubricant in the economy in terms of how it sort of functions. And it allows for new developments. It allows for mums and dads to create their own businesses or small business, but also allows large businesses to reinvest in their workforce, employ new people, and create new opportunities or new products, so to speak, and more people buy their homes and the like. So there's a number of uses for it, I guess. Yeah,
and debt shouldn't be. Look, I think sometimes you see in some commentary it's like debt is evil. Like debt is, it's part of life, and it lets us look. Do some people
probably how it's managed. Yeah, that's probably how it's managed. Is probably the concerning part.
Some people borrow in excess and everything else, but it also fuels a lot of economic activity.
Right.
That employs people, generates incomes, and all the rest of it.
But similar to in terms of how someone has overbought for a home that they can't afford, interest rates go up, that debt can be quite stressful. And that's what the concern is with businesses, with individuals, or credit card debt, for example, is also other debt that's terrible, used for other sort of mechanisms. But great, okay, so that's soft landing, hard landing. Where are we sort of seeing this? Are you thinking? I'll say my viewpoint. My viewpoint has been the Fed, all central banks around the world will be like, okay, let's hike. Oh shit, we've broken something. Let's turn it off. Let's turn it off over time, and you get that reversion. That has been the viewpoint. That yes, maybe inflation might be that sticky, and what we mean by sticky. There's a little bit of inflation there, probably at that target level that they really want it to be at.
Yeah.
But interest rates sort of come off because they can't afford to be going too high. Yeah. And when I mean by too high, what would you say? Too high for the Fed? How high did they lift the last time? Back in was it the
two handle?
Yeah, around the late or mid twos, which. If you think about it, that was pre-COVID, the amount of debt that we're seeing not only in the corporate world, but also in personal sort of hands. So the debt has really increased. So how do you, if it was hard, and they reverted from that, and that created a soft landing, so to speak, in 18 and 19. And then if they revert now from that, if they raise up to that level, I think it's more painful potentially to the economy than it was back then.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think what you've seen around the world.
Well, that's my opinion.
Yeah, and you've seen like a lot of people take advantage of very generous rates and other. So there was another thing in Australia called the TFF, which was this emergency funding facility the RBA created to support the banks, encourage them to lend. And that was basically how a lot of us could fix rates at like really attractive levels for only 3 years. And now if you turn around and say, oh, I want to fix my rates, it's a much more expensive proposition, to say the least. And look, there's a few reasons for that, but one of the big ones is the fact that TFF has expired and it's no longer available to our banks. But in terms of in terms of soft hard, where I see it, look, I think, me personally, what Dan was describing about the central banks taking their foot off the accelerator when it came to interest rates, do I think ultimately they will hit the pause button? Sure. Do I think some of the damage might have built up too much momentum by then? That's probably the question that's really plaguing me personally at the moment. And so, like, how do I actually approach it? I think, look, you'll have economists out there that'll give you a view like this year growth is going to be X%, or the Aussie dollar's going in this direction, right? Now, the reality is, as you look past 6 to 12 months, that view gets harder and harder to be accurate. And like, particularly if you see anyone come out, this is my 5-year forecast and my 10-year forecast, I'm going to safely say, like, hand on my heart, they're probably going to be wrong. The only question is how wrong, because the fact is, trying to predict the economy, it's too complicated, and long-term forecasts like that are doomed to failure, in my opinion. What am I trying to do instead? I'm trying to focus on, I guess, things I'd call leading indicators, so that give me a sense of like what the current health of the economy is, and like where is growth likely to head to at the moment, right? And
but again, that's just best guess. Almost.
It is,
really,
and
it's
only
trying
useful
to make an educated guess, but it's nonetheless a guess.
And they're only really useful for like a 3 to 6, maybe a 1 year time frame as well. What they're good for is trying to help you get a sense of like, are we at a turning point? So it's like, what are they telling me now? Some of the ones that I track, they're basically saying, look, growth peaked last year, and right now we're going through a period where growth is coming well off its elevated levels, where you saw stimulus coming out of lockdown. There's like a whole slew of consumer spending, and that really helped juice economic growth. We're seeing a lot of that come off now, right? And we're seeing governments step away. So in Australia, there's no JobKeeper. The emergency support programs have all lapsed effectively.
Turning off slowly, pretty much. The last few of the vouchers.
Exactly. And there's a similar issue in the US as well. So, and you've actually seen the US deficit bounce back very strongly. And while in some ways, look, the flip side is arguably that's a good thing, because the economy's recovering, you're seeing more tax revenue. The flip side of that argument is the government's not there supporting growth as much, and so one of the concerns people have is
because of that free money.
Yeah,
easy accessible.
Yeah, that easy money's getting spent, and then what's the next sort of kicker for growth? Are we going to start to see people, increase their borrowing to help fuel investment, new home buying, all the rest of it? I mean, if you look at the share prices of US home builders, you'd say probably not.
and to recap those signals, just quickly, the specific ones.
Yeah, so look, there's a few. So one is called the Conference Board Leading Economic Index, which is itself a bunch of different indicators for the US economy. Another one is from ECRI, which does a leading index for the US economy, and that's showing we're in soft landing territory already. In terms of the year-on-year rate of change. So the only question is, does it get worse from here over the next 6 months or not? But it's still very much an open question, and so there's a few different areas I'm following closely. Consumer confidence is another one.
That's a big one, to be honest.
But it's kind of weird as well, because if you look at one of the ones they track for the US is the University of Michigan's consumer.
Yes. But it's really, when you're looking at all this, demand has really come off. The confidence is getting hurt. That's what we're sort of seeing.
But it's only in specific sectors. I think it's a challenge. So certain things like retail is still doing quite well, and some of those areas that benefit from the economy reopening are doing better than well. Like if you look at Europe, for example, travel and the like, you're seeing like some real positives there. But the flip side, and let's bring up Europe as an example, most of those countries are energy importers, and the flip side is just the amount of energy inflation you see now. And I was doing a prezzo on it this week, where you're just
dependency to Russia and Russian gas, and Germany turning off pretty much all its nuclear power plants, and not having any other sort of sources for energy, and coal plants being sort of shut down.
The ongoing conflict between Russia and the Ukraine, and the flow and impact that's had to energy markets, as sort of Russian, even though Russian energy isn't sanctioned as such, it's become less available in global terms, because people aren't as willing to handle it because they're worried about sanctions being imposed and the like, and that's had a flow-on consequence for energy prices remaining elevated. And I think that's a real question, like when is some of this inflation going to really start seeing growth and like consumer spending really tank? And arguably you haven't seen that too much outside of certain sectors, but that's the concern. And arguably you're starting to see it in the US now. So not our target, US target, saw its share price take a massive hit the other week because they missed on their earnings guidance and had a massive inventory build. So, which is basically, that's a way of saying they thought people were going to be spending more, so they bought all this product, and now they've got this massive pile of stuff sitting in warehouses.
I think it's the difference here is they saw demand really at that X level, and it wasn't there. Like maybe might have been there when we had COVID. Yeah, sure. People, you look at your likes of your stores like Target and the rest, and there's probably flow-on effects of potentially stores, the retail stores that we have here. Now that's probably that they thought demand would be much higher than what it was. They had they bought all that extra inventory for the supply. It's just not being sort of there's no demand to buy it. But again, going back on those signals, a broken clock could be right twice a day. And it's the same with some of those signals, to be honest. It just really shows a rough direction of where we can go and where things are going, but it's not a be all and end all.
No.
But in saying that, I am dying to try the next wine. Let's probably move on to that one then.
Sure. So the other wine we've got today is a 2006 Marsanne from a winery called Tabilk. It used to be called Chateau Tabilk, but then EU trade negotiations put a stop to that.
We have a lot of problems doing that at these sessions where we have old wines. But anyway, continue.
This is a bit of a history lesson. Tabilk is probably one of the oldest proponents of this particular grape, which is called Marsanne. So it's famous for a region in France called the Rhone Valley, which is known to be fairly hot, but and so it's well known for varieties like Marsanne, Viognier, Roussanne, which in Australian terms you won't find too much. Tabilk's one of the rare examples. You're starting to see a few producers grow it in the likes of South Australia and the Barossa. Victoria, you see some examples as well, but outside of Margaret River, you see a couple too.
Yeah, Margaret River would have a few.
But so this wine is kind of in some ways it's meant to be a similar mode to what we were having earlier, the Semillon, but it's also different. So this is meant to have a bit more body.
It's 2006.
Yeah, and this is age as well. So as it gets older, it's supposed to develop sort of more of a honeysuckle vibe.
Yep.
And I think, to be honest with you, it's one of those ones where it's not as generous as a Semillon, I thought. Like it's not a terrible wine by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm almost like, did it need to be left hidden for another 5-10 years?
It's
so that's
different to the Semillon.
Yeah, but it's not as generous. Like it's not.
I prefer the first one, Semillon.
Oh yeah, like this thing for me, and it could be, the person I bought it off. I got this at auction too. Could be like I just got a dud bottle, and that's always a risk when you buy at auction, particularly for older wines. It's kind of, you're playing a lottery.
Similar to what we did last session.
Exactly.
In the 1989, that could have been a complete miss, but it wasn't. Thankfully.
No.
But that's right.
Like this one, I wouldn't say it's faulty necessarily, but I wouldn't say that. It's been under screw cap, and so it shouldn't have any. Sometimes wine, if it's under cork, the wine gets exposed to oxygen too early, and it just goes. You're basically drinking vinegar, so it's terrible. This isn't that. It's just more, I guess, austere. It's just a bit lacking, and it's got a bit of that honey.
It's got some of the flavors, but it doesn't. It's not like the other where it lasts. And
No,
I think that's the thing where you have to really focus on what you're getting.
Yeah, it's very quiet voice.
Subtle. But the other was, I don't know, it had some more complexity to it, but it had those flavors.
It was a lot more generous.
Flavors,
like it's still, for something that's 13 years old, the other one, it still had heaps of fruit to it, and then it had those additional layers with the toasty flavors and everything else. It was just, just pure and simple. It was a lot more of a pleasure to drink. And you could have had that with food or even by itself and be very happy with the deal. So I think at this stage, which would I prefer between the two? Probably the Semillon.
The first one?
Yeah, I'd heard really great things about old Marsanne, and I guess for this one, it's just a bit of a pass for me.
Yeah. I think I prefer the first, but there will be people that like this one potentially.
Potentially. But
I know my brother will be the one that probably prefers the second over the first.
Really?
Yep.
Okay.
I don't get it, but I know, with experience, it probably has been his sort of viewpoint. But
look, it's I
don't know. I like the first one, to be honest. I really like the first one. Yeah.
The second one's textural. It's got like almost a waxy.
But it also depends on what type of wine drink you want. If you're not really a white drinker and you like your heavy reds, the second one probably will be it. It will be.
You reckon?
I think a little bit, because there's a level of almost sweetness, but not. It's different. The flavors are much more
the flavors
pronounced.
are different.
That's all. Yeah.
I think. To be honest with you, I think 90. There will be people that like the second one, but I think the people's choice will be the first one.
Okay.
Before
we get into the ratings, where are we at? So we've covered a little bit more on the interest rates, covered a little bit more on potential, soft hard. So I would sort of in the camp of we're probably getting to a hard landing.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the raising the fears of recessionary environment. I think we might see that recessionary environment.
And
maybe it might be not long and maybe not long recession, but we will be getting there.
Yeah.
And making sure, I guess, from a asset allocation perspective, you're looking at portfolio and saying, okay, well, how much beta do I really have in the portfolio? And when we're talking about beta, the overall risk or level of risk compared to the market.
But basically what Dan's saying there, like how much beta, it's like just how much am I allocated to equities at this point? And look, if you've been like really heavy on the equity side, if you've been really heavy crypto as well.
Well, that's right.
And anything that's sort of like
or tech stocks.
You've been in a world of pain this year.
Yeah.
I mean, my brother shared me something on Reddit this tech bro in the US was down $1 million or $2 million in terms of what his portfolio is worth.
That's gotta hurt.
Yeah, but then I'm saying to my brother, I'm like, the dude makes I think total comp was almost 400K a year. It's it delays his plans to retire at the age of 35 a bit, probably, but
can't have everything.
Yeah. So
sure.
Yeah, I think I would say just on that growth, soft versus hard, I'd say I'm probably more worried about the hard landing in the US and Europe as well, just given some of the challenges.
I think there's more of a hard landing risk in Europe, and a lot bigger recession in Europe, given the war in the Ukraine, given all those sort of issues, than there is anywhere else. I think the US probably it's slightly less, but still quite.
Yeah, I think the question that no one really knows, and for context, back in end of 2018, we saw the Federal Reserve sort of walk away from the brink and go, okay, guys, we've pushed things too hard with rates, and the question is whether or not they'll have one of those moments
that happens again. And last time they did that, in 2018, 2019, bonds did what, 20% that year, 23%.
They had a crack in.
That was duration. We're talking about semi-government or government bonds. Now, okay, we've got a little bit of that. I think what I wanted to quickly sort of go to before I sort of finalise on inflation, that quick little sort of a snapshot that really came into my head, and I was like, I need to really, talk about this. Was stagflation. That's the discussion in terms of there's a bit of discussion around that. What is that? Is that there a possibility of that even in the short run for maybe a short period of time? But what is I guess an explanation on stagflation?
So I think for me, stagflation, like hyperinflation, which I won't go into, but it's one of those buzzwords you see people throw up in the headlines way too easily. I think, and look, there are different ways to define it. The way I'd look at it, it's basically when you basically have a recession and you still have elevated levels of inflation. So you get a double whammy, right? You get higher unemployment, so people are out of work, and in addition, you've got high inflation as well. So it's a really
is going up.
It's a really tough time for everyone, right? That's what my focus on that term would be, and I think people like to bandy it about a little bit too much.
I would also sort of add there's also low growth as part of all that. That's all happening with there being low growth. So the
negative, like the economy
negative. So right? Things are all all going up and down the same sort of trajectory. You have inflation up, you have unemployment up. And you have low growth or no growth. That's that stagflationary type environment. So something to sort of think about.
If you hear someone evoke that, just be cautious, because it's one of those things that I guess triggers alarm bells, and the person's obviously trying to evoke the 70s, which was a very tough time around the world for everyone that wasn't an oil producing country, basically. But just be cautious of it. Like, is it a threat we need to worry about? Look, one of the big drivers of that stagflation period in the 70s was production cuts from oil producing nations in the Middle East. That was one of the big drivers, and it really hurt the global economy in general, right? I think, could we see a repeat? Arguably, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has set up some of those conditions. I think.
And if you compare periods, it's a mix of that 70s period is probably a mix of that, the 90s period with the tech bubble bursting. So it's a mix of all these in one in this current environment with high debt.
And look, I think, can we have a period, right, where say economies enter recession and inflation's still high because of oil prices and the like? Look, maybe to an extent, but I think eventually gravity is going to catch up with them. Like, this is my view. And look, what defines a recession is the economy is contracting. There's less demand for stuff, especially commodities, and eventually that's going to be borne to the front. Now, can there be specifics where some commodity prices remain elevated because there is still that structural demand for things like EVs and that? Potentially. But at the end of the day, all that stuff depends on there being an end consumer ready, willing, and able to buy the goods. So I personally think gravity will catch those impulses, and so that whole stagflation aspect, I think eventually it's going to abate. I think one of the big reasons why we've had such elevated inflation, besides the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is the fact global supply chains are really troubled still
and shifting.
And well, they're shifting, but the whole saga we've had in China with their zero COVID policy has just exacerbated it, right? Like you've got a bunch of ships that can't dock in Chinese ports, and it's just created a whole slew of bottlenecks again. So look, that's an area I'm following closely, and you arguably seen some signs of improvement in it, where I think it was the port of Los Angeles who started to see throughput, like the amount of amount of containers and stuff going through start to recover. But yeah, it's just a difficult setup, and it's just something we've never had before as well as the other tough part.
And I think just to sort of close it off on that whole, the inflation part, what I sort of noticed was we've probably had inflation before this period and in asset class prices. That's now converted into inflation into goods. It's yet to convert into inflation specifically into services. But we're sort of seeing that sort of transition. And it feels like maybe that was a transition based on where things are at, based on low rates, based on a number of factors and the quantitative easing that was done by central banks, printing of money, etc., that could have caused these issues. But then rolling it back a bit, in looking at inflation, if the numbers now coming out of the US start to slow or start to meet expectations or sort of miss targets and start to go down on the flip side, you might see as what the Fed sort of mentioned the other day, where a Fed member or one of the Dove members, so you've got the Hawks that want to raise rates, you have the Doves that want to maintain or lower rates. You had one of the Doves come out and say, maybe we need to focus on how much the economy is in stress, hold off rate rises until September and see what the current ones have done after we raise again, and then maybe sort of look for next year in terms of reverting that. Now, the Hawks sort of came out after that and said, no, that's not it. But, Chairman Powell is probably, in a bit of a tough situation, understanding from both sides, the political angle and the like. So, yeah, that's sort of my rant on the inflationary environment, but I think that's probably leads us closer now to the end in terms of the rating system.
We can talk about the ratings. So do you want to...
Yes, I'm excited about this. I'm super excited. Okay, great. So rating 1, buy the bottle. It's pretty, self-explanatory.
Yeah, for the first one, you wouldn't be disappointed.
Rating 2, buy the glass. I think it's good for 1.
I think it's... I don't know if it's not ready yet.
Rating 4 is...
Oh, we're talking about that.
Oh, you were just talking about the ratings.
Yeah.
Rating 4 is... 1 is buy the bottle. 2 is buy the glass. Number 3, is lock up. The extension, lock up.
It's like an ancillary category. It's like the wine's just not ready yet. It's not buy the glass, buy the bottle. It's just... It needs some time,
but needs a lot of time. So have that in terms of, okay, well that's the third rating, and then the fourth being pass. Probably best to not have it. But yeah, so number 1, the first wine we had, what would you sort of say? I'd say buy the bottle.
Yeah, comfortably.
Maybe buy a couple of bottles.
Yeah, it's one of those, like if you were drinking it with a bit of age, I don't think anyone you were serving it to would be upset.
Great. And the second one.
Yeah, I to be honest with you, I'm on the keep it locked up for a while yet, and maybe it improves. But it's almost to the point where, to be honest with you, if I got a glass of that in a restaurant, I'd be like, it's all right.
Yeah, I'd say lock it up.
Yeah,
lock it up. Lock that up.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm going to caveat that with saying it might, to be honest with you, unless
Depends on the person as well. But
Yeah.
again, I still think it probably needs a little bit more time, or maybe it could have been just you got sold a dud.
Yeah, and
A
look,
lemon.
that's an important thing just to remember. White wine, especially, you don't want to keep it somewhere where it's exposed to light, because that can actually damage the wine and
Yep.
it can really dull the flavors.
Well,
and
most
aromas.
wines you want it to be, white
Re-
especially, but
Yeah.
again, you want it to stay away from sunlight.
Yeah.
Hence why a lot of wine fridges are glazed.
Yes.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I hope you guys everyone listening enjoyed the session. We had a lot of fun, and look forward to the next one, and hopefully able to attend that one and listen to the next session.
Yeah.
All right. So have a great one. Thank you.
Cheers, guys. See ya.